The document had been sealed for 11 years. Mr. Alderton, the family solicitor, held it with both hands as though the paper itself carried weight beyond its age. The study smelled of old leather and extinguished candles, the kind of room that remembered things. 3 people sat in silence around the mahogany table. Eleanor Whitmore, her Uncle Gerald, and a solicitor who had not yet found the courage to look any of them in the eye. Eleanor kept her hands folded in her lap, still, controlled. Her black morning dress pressed against the high-backed chair, and she did not allow herself to shift, not once, even as the clock on the mantel marked the slow, uncomfortable passing of each minute. Her father had died 6 days ago. She had not cried yet, not because she did not feel it. She felt it like a stone lodged somewhere between her ribs, but because crying in front of Gerald Whitmore had never once changed anything. "Shall we proceed?" Mr. Alderton said finally. Gerald leaned forward. "We've been waiting 20 minutes. "We are waiting," the solicitor replied carefully, "for the other party." The door opened before Eleanor could ask what that meant. He did not knock. Duke Alexander Cavendish stepped into the room the way winter enters a house, without announcement, without apology, with a cold that settles before you realize the door was ever open. He was taller than she expected, broader. The charcoal coat sat perfectly across his shoulders, and his jaw held the kind of tension that suggested he had not smiled in a very long time. Perhaps not at all. He did not look at Gerald. He did not look at Mr. Alderton. His eyes found Eleanor immediately and stayed there for exactly 1 second longer than they should have. She did not look away. He sat across from her without a word, and the room rearranged itself around his presence the way rooms always did, quietly, involuntarily, as if the furniture itself understood who held authority here. Mr. Alderton cleared his throat and began to read. The estate, Eleanor already knew, was gone. Her father had been generous with his affections and careless with his accounts, and the Whitmore name now carried more sentiment than substance. The London house, the country property, the investments that had dissolved quietly over the past decade like sugar in warm water. She had known for 2 years. She had simply never said it aloud. What she did not know, what none of them knew apparently except the man sitting across from her with his hands perfectly still on the table, was the clause on the 4th page. Mr. Alderton read it twice, once for accuracy, once, Eleanor suspected, because he could not quite believe it himself. "In the event of my death, and in order to secure the financial protection of my daughter, Eleanor Margaret Whitmore, I have entered into a prior agreement with the Duke of Cavendish. Said agreement stipulates that Eleanor shall be offered in marriage to the Duke within 30 days of my passing, and that upon acceptance, all outstanding debts of the Whitmore estate shall be considered settled in full." The clock ticked. Gerald made a sound that was not quite a word. Eleanor did not move. She read the clause again in her mind, more slowly this time, the way you read something you want to be certain you understood correctly before you respond to it. Her father's handwriting was on the signature line. She recognized the particular loop of his W, the way he always pressed too hard at the end of his name. He had arranged this, without telling her, without asking her. She looked up. Duke Cavendish was watching her with an expression that revealed absolutely nothing. No satisfaction, no discomfort, no apology, just that steady, unreadable gaze that the papers called cold and the servants called dangerous, and that Eleanor, in this particular moment, decided to call something else entirely. Careful, she thought, he is being very careful. "Miss Whitmore." Mr. Alderton's voice was gentle, the way people speak to those they expect to shatter. "You are under no legal obligation to—" "I understand the clause," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She was grateful for that. Gerald turned to her. "Eleanor, you cannot seriously consider—" "I wasn't speaking to you, Uncle." The silence that followed had texture. She felt Cavendish's attention shift, not visibly, not in any way she could have pointed to, but something in the room changed in the half-second after she cut Gerald off. A stillness that was different from the stillness before. She looked at the Duke directly. He was waiting. She understood that about him immediately, in the instinctive way you understand things about people before you have words for it. He expected something. Refusal, perhaps. Tears. The particular kind of panic that comes with having no good options and no time to find them. Eleanor Whitmore took a slow breath. She had learned a long time ago that the most dangerous thing a woman in her position could do was let a room full of men decide her response for her. "I will marry you, Your Grace." The words landed in the room like a key turning in a lock. Not loud, not dramatic, but final, in a way that made everyone go still. She paused. And then, before the Duke could arrange his expression into whatever he had prepared for acceptance, before Gerald could exhale, before Mr. Alderton could reach for his pen, "But I will never belong to you." Duke Alexander Cavendish looked at her. For the first time since he walked through that door, something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not offense, something she did not yet have a name for. He said nothing. And somehow, in the silence that followed, Eleanor understood that this was not a man accustomed to having no response. Before we continue, where are you watching from today? Drop your city in the comments. It always means so much to know who is here with us. The carriage ride back to Whitmore House was silent. Eleanor sat with her hands in her lap and watched the London streets pass outside the frost-edged window. She allowed herself, for exactly 30 seconds, to feel the full weight of what she had just agreed to. 30 seconds, then she folded it away. She had a month before the wedding. She intended to use every day of it. The fire in Alexander's study had burned down to embers by the time Graves set the last candle on the desk and quietly withdrew. He did not ask if the Duke needed anything else. Graves had worked at Cavendish Manor for 19 years and understood with the particular intelligence of men who observe without speaking that there were nights when being asked anything at all was its own kind of intrusion. Alexander stood at the window. London stretched below in cold silence, the streets emptied by the hour and the temperature, the gas lamps throwing pale circles against the cobblestones. He held a glass of brandy he had not touched. His reflection looked back at him from the dark glass, the straight line of his shoulders, the set of his jaw, and he studied it with the detachment of a man examining someone he used to know. "I will never belong to you." He set the glass down. He had expected tears. He had prepared in his careful and private way for the particular discomfort of a young woman receiving news that her life had been decided without her consent. He had a response ready for anger, for silence, for the kind of quiet devastation that proper women of good breeding wore like a second mourning dress. He had not prepared for that, not for the steadiness of her voice, not for the way she looked at him, not through him, not past him, but at him, the way very few people ever had, as though she saw something the rest of London had collectively agreed not to look at directly. He turned from the window. The study was full of things that had belonged to his father, and his father's father before that. The mahogany bookshelves with their ordered rows, the portraits with their identical expressions of composed authority, the desk that had hosted decisions that shaped lives and ended partnerships, and rearranged the financial landscape of half the county without a single raised voice. Cavendish men did not raise their voices. They did not need to. Power, his father told him once, does not announce itself. Alexander had believed that. For most of his life, he had built himself around it. He sat down at the desk and opened the ledger in front of him without reading it. 7 years ago, the study had looked exactly like this. The fire lower, the hour later, and a man named Edmund Hartwell sitting in the chair across from the desk, the same chair Eleanor Whitmore had not sat in that afternoon because she had stood at the window with her back half turned and her arms crossed and her attention on the rain, as though the weather were more interesting than the contract her solicitor was reviewing. But that was this afternoon. 7 years ago, Edmund Hartwell sat in that chair with the expression of a man who had run out of roads. He was not a bad man. That was what Alexander remembered most clearly, not the numbers in the ledger, not the letter that laid out everything in precise and damning detail, but the particular quality of Hartwell's shame. It was not the shame of someone caught doing what they always intended to do. It was the shame of someone who made one wrong decision, then another to cover it, then another to cover that one, until the distance between who they were and what they had done became too vast to walk back across. The trust fund had supported 11 families on the Hartwell estate, tenants mostly, a schoolmaster, a widow with 3 daughters. The embezzlement had gone unnoticed for 2 years. Alexander had noticed. He set the letter on the desk between them and waited. Hartwell looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "My wife doesn't know." "I'm aware." "The children." "I'm aware of that as well." The silence lasted nearly a minute. Outside, rain moved across the windows in slow grey sheets, and somewhere in the house, a clock announced midnight with the measured indifference of things that mark time without caring what the time means. "What do you want?" Hartwell asked finally. Alexander told him. The arrangement was not complicated. The Hartwell properties, 3 of them modest, accumulated over 2 generations, would transfer to Cavendish ownership. The outstanding debts to the trust fund would be absorbed quietly, repaid through Alexander's own accounts over the course of 18 months, attributed to an investment renegotiation that existed only on paper. Hartwell would resign from his social obligations, cite his health, and relocate his family to the continent. His wife would never know the real reason. His children would grow up with their name intact. In exchange, Alexander's silence, complete and permanent. It was not generosity. He had not done it to be generous. He had done it because 11 families would lose their livelihoods if the scandal broke publicly, and because Catherine Hartwell had 4 children under the age of 8 and had not made her husband's choices, and because the law in its precision would punish everyone equally without caring at all about the difference. What he had not fully calculated was what it would look like from outside. Society saw a feared duke consuming a weaker man's estate in the middle of the night. They saw Hartwell gone within the month, his family vanished quietly to Florence, his properties absorbed into Cavendish Holdings with no public explanation. They built a story from the shape of what they could observe, and the story they built was not kind. He never corrected it. Correcting it would have required explaining it. Explaining it would have required exposing Hartwell's crime, and exposing Hartwell's crime would have done precisely what the arrangement was designed to prevent. So the Duke of Cavendish said nothing, and the silence over 7 years had calcified into reputation. The clock on the mantel struck 2. Alexander closed the ledger. He was not thinking about Hartwell anymore. He was thinking about a woman in a black morning dress who had looked at him across a table this afternoon and said, "I will never belong to you," with the calm of someone who had already decided, long before entering the room, exactly which parts of herself she intended to protect. He recognized that kind of calm. He had built his entire life around it. A knock at the door. "Your Grace." Graves's voice, careful as always. A letter arrived by messenger. The sender indicated it was urgent. "Leave it." The envelope appeared on the edge of the desk without another word. Alexander did not reach for it immediately. He looked at the fire for a moment, at the last of the embers, then picked it up. The seal was unfamiliar. A clean, simple W pressed into dark wax. Whitmore. He opened it. The handwriting was precise, unhurried. The kind of penmanship that suggested someone who chose each word before committing it to paper. "Your Grace, I believe it would be to our mutual benefit to discuss the specific terms of this arrangement before any formal announcements are made. I am available at your convenience, though I would prefer sooner rather than later. I do not intend to be difficult. I intend to be clear. E. Whitmore." Alexander read it twice. Then, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something. She arrived exactly on time, not a minute early, which would have suggested eagerness, and not a minute late, which would have suggested either nerves or a point being made. Exactly on time, which, Alexander suspected, was its own kind of statement. Graves led her into the east drawing room at 10:30, and Alexander was already standing when she entered, which was not something he had planned. He simply found himself on his feet before the door finished opening, which was the kind of involuntary thing he did not particularly care to examine. Eleanor Whitmore wore grey today, a simpler dress than the morning black from the afternoon before, practical in its cut, with no unnecessary ornamentation, no lace at the cuffs, no brooch at the collar. Her dark hair was arranged with precision rather than artistry. She looked like someone who had made a decision about what the morning required and had dressed accordingly. She looked around the room once, a brief observational sweep that took in the ceiling height, the arrangement of furniture, the painting above the fireplace, and then her attention settled on him. "Your Grace, Miss Whitmore," he gestured toward the chairs near the window. "Please." She sat. He sat across from her. Between them, a small table held a tea service that Graves had arranged with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that difficult conversations went slightly better with something warm to hold. Eleanor did not reach for the tea immediately. "I appreciate you receiving me," she said. "You indicated it was urgent. I indicated it was to our mutual benefit. A small correction delivered without apology. Those are different things." He looked at her. She looked back. "Very well," he said. "What are your terms?" She reached into the small bag at her side and produced a folded sheet of paper. Not a letter, he realized, but a list. Neat columns, precise handwriting. She had come prepared in the way that suggested she had not slept particularly well, but had used the hours productively. "I have 4, she said. "They are not unreasonable. I'll determine that." Something flickered in her expression. Not offense, not quite. And then settled. She unfolded the paper. "First, I will manage the Whitmore household accounts independently. I do not require an allowance disbursed at your discretion. A quarterly settlement, agreed upon in advance, is sufficient." Alexander said nothing. She continued. "Second, I will not be required to attend social engagements I find purposeless. I'm willing to fulfill the public obligations the Cavendish name requires. I am not willing to spend 3 evenings a week in drawing rooms performing a contentment I do not feel." He studied her. The way she held the paper, steady, no tension in her fingers. The way she delivered each point as though she had tested the weight of every word before this morning and discarded the ones that wouldn't hold. "Third," she said, "my correspondence remains private. I will not read yours. I ask the same consideration." "And the fourth?" She folded the paper once, precisely along its original crease, and set it on the table between them. "If either of us finds, after 1 year, that this arrangement causes more damage than it resolves, to reputation, to well-being, or to the people connected to both our names, we discuss it, directly, not through solicitors." The room was quiet. Outside, the London morning moved past the windows with its particular grey-skied indifference. A carriage, the distant call of a vendor, the soft percussion of rain beginning against glass. Alexander looked at the paper on the table, then at her. "You wrote these last night," he said. "Yes, after receiving news that your father arranged your marriage without your knowledge. Also, yes, most people," he said, "would have taken longer than 1 evening." Eleanor tilted her head, a fraction of a degree. "Most people spend time on feelings that I prefer to spend on solutions. No offense to feelings." He almost said something. He stopped himself. "Your first 3 terms are acceptable," he said instead. "And the fourth?" "The fourth," he said, "implies that you anticipate problems." "The fourth," she replied evenly, "implies that I anticipate being honest about them, which is not the same thing." Alexander set down the cup he had not realized he picked up. He had conducted a considerable number of negotiations in his life, with solicitors, creditors, tenants, members of Parliament who preferred the appearance of consultation to its actual practice. He understood the mechanics of a room in which 2 people each wanted something and were deciding how much to reveal about what that something was. This did not feel like that. It felt unexpectedly, like being spoken to by someone who had decided in advance and without apology to simply tell the truth and see what happened. He was not certain what to do with that. "You'll want to see the East Wing," he said finally. "It's been prepared for your use, separate from the main residence, which I imagine will suit your preference for—" "Independence," she offered. "I was going to say privacy. They're related." He stood. She stood a half-second after, not quickly, not as though following his lead, but as though they had arrived at the same conclusion at the same time by different routes. Graves appeared in the doorway, with the particular timing of a man who had spent 2 decades anticipating exits. Alexander gestured toward the corridor. Eleanor stepped forward, and as she passed the small table, her hand reached briefly toward the folded list, then stopped. She left it where it was. An offering, perhaps, or a statement of trust. He was not sure which. He found that he wanted to know. The East Wing tour lasted 40 minutes. Eleanor said very little. She looked at everything. The windows, the height of the ceilings, the arrangement of light in each room at this particular hour of the morning, with the focused attention of someone cataloguing rather than admiring. She asked 2 questions: where the household accounts were maintained, and whether the library was accessible to the East Wing directly or required passing through the main residence. "Directly," Alexander said. "Good," she said. Nothing else. At the end of the corridor, she stopped at the last window. The garden below was bare in the February cold, the hedges clipped, the paths clean, the whole thing composed with the same quiet authority as the rest of Cavendish Manor. Orderly, deliberate, the kind of beauty that asked nothing of you and gave nothing away. She looked at it for a moment. He stood slightly behind her and to the left, near enough to see the faint reflection of her face in the glass, not her expression, just the line of it, and found himself wondering, with a specificity that surprised him, what she was thinking. He did not ask. "I'll have my things moved by Thursday," she said, still facing the window. "There's no urgency. There is for me." She turned then, and the morning light shifted across her face, something in it that was not quite sadness and not quite resolve, but somewhere between the two, in the place where people carry things they have decided not to put down. "Whitmore House is full of my father at the moment. I'd rather begin whatever this is than stay inside a grief I can't yet organize." She said it simply, without performance, without asking for a response. Alexander said nothing. He was not sure what he could have said that would not have been less than what the moment deserved. She walked past him toward the staircase, her footsteps quiet on the stone floor, and he stayed at the window for a moment longer than necessary. The garden below held its silence. He looked at it and thought, briefly before he set the thought aside, that a woman who grieved practically was either the most composed person he had ever met, or the one who felt things most deeply and trusted the fewest people with it. He was not sure which. He suspected without evidence that it was both. 3 weeks into the arrangement, Alexander established a fact he had not anticipated needing to establish. Eleanor Whitmore was not easy to ignore. This was not a quality he could have predicted from the afternoon in Alderton's office, or from the morning of the terms, or even from the first days in the East Wing when she moved through Cavendish Manor with the careful restraint of someone determined not to take up more space than she had been offered. She was quiet. She was self-contained. She made no demands on his time and no claims on his attention. And yet, she was in the library at 6 in the morning when he came down for the ledgers, already at the far table with a cup of tea that had gone half cold and 3 books open simultaneously in the particular arrangement of someone who reads across subjects rather than through them. She did not look up when he entered. She said good morning to the page she was reading, and he said it back to the room, and they shared the library for 40 minutes in a silence that was, against all reasonable expectation, entirely comfortable. She knew the head groundskeeper by name within 4 days of arriving. Not the formal name, the name his wife used. She had learned it by asking, which was not a complicated method, but one that apparently had not occurred to anyone else at Cavendish Manor in the past decade. She disagreed with him at dinner on a Tuesday, not about anything consequential, about the drainage system on the North Field, which she had apparently been reading about in the 3rd of those simultaneously open books. And she did it the way she did most things, directly without softening it first, and then moved on to the next subject before he had fully processed that it had happened. He found himself paying attention in a way he had not agreed to. The evening that changed the specific quality of his attention arrived without announcement, as those evenings tend to do. He heard it from the corridor, a voice low and unhurried, coming from the small sitting room near the East Wing entrance. Not Eleanor's voice, a younger one, uneven with the particular rhythm of someone trying not to cry in front of a person they respected. He did not intend to stop. He stopped. Through the half-open door, Eleanor, sitting not in the chair but on the footstool, which brought her to eye level with the young housemaid, Polly, 14, recently arrived from the village, who sat rigidly on the edge of the settee with her hands pressed flat against her apron. "You don't have to explain it," Eleanor said. "Not all of it. Just tell me which part is the hardest." A long pause. Then Polly said very quietly something Alexander couldn't hear. "That's the part we fix first then," Eleanor said. "The rest can wait." He moved past the doorway before either of them looked up. He walked to the end of the corridor and stood there for a moment with no particular reason to be standing there, and recognized, with the clarity of someone encountering an unexpected change in familiar terrain, that the thing he had assumed about Eleanor Whitmore, that her composure was a kind of distance, was not accurate. It was not distance at all. It was the opposite. She had simply learned to be steady so that other people could afford to be unsteady near her. He had been watching the wrong thing entirely. She found him in the gallery the following afternoon. He was standing in front of the portrait at the far end, the one most visitors walked past quickly because it was smaller than the others and hung in the poorest light. And the man in it wore no military uniform, no chain of office, nothing to indicate rank beyond the quality of the coat. His grandfather, the one the family histories described in a single paragraph and then set aside. Eleanor stopped a few feet back. She looked at the portrait, then at him. "He's not like the others," she said. "No. He looks like he's thinking about something outside the frame." Alexander looked at the portrait. He had stood in front of it many times over the years, often without fully knowing why. He was. According to my father, he spent most of his life thinking about things nobody else in the room was thinking about yet. Your father said that admiringly? My father said it as a warning. A beat of silence. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, studying the portrait with that focused attention he had come to recognize, the look that meant she was filing something away rather than simply observing it. And was it, she asked, a warning or a description? He looked at her. The afternoon light came through the high gallery windows at a low angle, the kind of winter light that arrived without warmth, but with unusual clarity, and it caught the edge of her profile as she waited for his answer with no particular urgency, the way she always waited, as though she had nowhere more important to be and no investment in what he chose to say, only in whether he chose to say something true. Both, he said, depending on the day. Something shifted in her expression, not a smile. Something quieter than that, the particular look of a person who has heard an honest answer in a place they expected a polished one. My father was the same, she said, and the past tense landed in the sentence with the small specific weight of a fresh loss that had not yet learned to travel lightly. He always thought three things at once, two of them useful and one of them impractical, and he could never always tell which was which until it was too late to matter. She said it without self-pity, a simple fact, offered without asking for anything in return. Alexander said nothing. He had learned in these weeks that Eleanor's silences were not invitations to fill the space. They were completions, periods at the end of sentences that meant exactly what they said, and did not require a response so much as a witness. He stood with her in front of the portrait for another minute. She was the first to move, a step back, a slight turn toward the corridor. Dinner is at 7, she said. It is. I was thinking of asking Graves to change it to past. The kitchen staff seem rushed. You can do that. She looked at him with a brief, almost imperceptible surprise, as though she had expected an objection and had prepared one back and now had nowhere to put it. Then, all right. She walked toward the corridor. He watched her go, the quiet, unhurried pace, the way she paused at the doorway and glanced back at the portrait one more time, not at him, just at the man in the painting, with his gaze aimed at something outside the frame. Then she was gone. Alexander turned back to his grandfather's portrait. He spent most of his life thinking about things nobody else in the room was thinking about yet. He stood there for a long moment in the pale afternoon light. There was something he wanted to say, and he had no one to say it to, and he was not entirely certain yet what it was. That was new. The letters were in the wrong box. That was how Eleanor found them, not by searching, not by intention, but because her father had been a man of considerable sentiment and inconsistent organization, and the box labeled Correspondence, Household 1847 to 1849 contained, in its bottom layer beneath 2 years of mundane domestic letters, a bundle of 12 documents tied with the kind of practical knot that suggested they had been accessed more than once. She was in Whitmore House on a Wednesday, sorting through what remained. The solicitor had asked her to identify any outstanding personal correspondence before the estate was formally settled. She had expected receipts and invitation replies, and perhaps a few sentimental notes from old friends. She set the bundle on the desk and untied it. The first letter was dated 4 years ago. The handwriting on the outside was her father's. The seal that had been broken was not. It was a C. Cavendish. She read them in order. The fire in the study burned down without her noticing. Outside, the afternoon shifted from grey to the particular bluish dark of a February evening, and Eleanor sat in her father's chair and read each letter twice. Once quickly, the way you read something you are trying to understand, and once slowly, the way you read something you are trying to accept. The correspondence began simply enough. A business matter. Her father consulting the Duke on a question of estate management. A connection made through a mutual acquaintance. Formal, unremarkable. By the third letter, the tone had changed. Her father had asked a direct question. There are things said about you in society, Your Grace, that I find difficult to reconcile with the man I have come to know through these exchanges. I would ask plainly, because I'm too old for indirection. Is there truth to what is said of the Hartwell matter? She turned to Alexander's response. It was not what she expected. He did not deflect. He did not offer the smooth non-answer of a man accustomed to protecting his reputation. He told her father the truth, the full shape of it, The embezzlement and the families and the arrangement, the reason the properties had transferred and the reason Hartwell's name had never been publicly destroyed. He told it plainly, without seeking absolution, and at the end wrote one line that Eleanor read 3 times. "I do not tell you this in search of vindication, Mr. Whitmore. I tell you because you asked honestly, and because I find increasingly that honest men are rare enough to deserve honesty in return." Her father's reply came 2 weeks later. It was 3 sentences. "I believe you. I am sorry the world has not been more precise in its judgments. You are the kind of man I would trust with something I valued greatly." Eleanor set the letter down. The fire had gone to embers. The room was cold in the way that rooms go cold when you have been sitting still for too long without noticing. She did not move to add wood to the grate. She sat with the letters in her lap and understood for the first time the full architecture of what her father had done. Not a careless man gambling with his daughter's future on a financial arrangement. Not a desperate man taking the easiest solution. A man who had spent 4 years quietly, privately, coming to a conclusion about the character of Duke Alexander Cavendish, and who had, in his final act, placed his most valued thing accordingly. "You are the kind of man I would trust with something I valued greatly." Eleanor pressed her fingers against her eyes. She did not cry. But it was a near thing, not grief exactly, or not only grief, but the particular ache of discovering that someone who loved you understood you well enough to choose for you, even knowing you would be furious about it, even knowing you would walk into that solicitor's office and set your jaw and say, "I will never belong to you." Because he had known, apparently, that was exactly what you would say. And he had decided the man on the other side of the table was someone who would hear it and not flinch. She sat in the dark for a long time. Then she tied the letters back in their knot, placed them in her bag and went to find the carriage home. She did not go home. She told the driver Cavendish Manor without fully deciding to. The way you make certain decisions before your more cautious self has time to weigh in. The streets were quiet at this hour, lanterns moving through the mist, the horse's breath clouding in the cold air, London arranging itself into the particular stillness it wore between 10 and midnight. Graves let her in without visible surprise. This, Eleanor thought, said something about both Graves and the household she had apparently become part of. She found Alexander in the study. He was at the desk with the ledger, the same position she had seen him in a dozen times in 3 weeks. The late-night accounting, the quiet discipline of a man who managed his responsibilities the way he managed everything else, thoroughly, privately, without requiring acknowledgement. A single lamp burned on the desk. The rest of the room held a comfortable darkness that suggested he had been sitting in it long enough that it no longer felt like dark at all. He looked up when she entered. She set the bundle of letters on the desk between them. He looked at them. He did not move. "My father kept your correspondence," she said. "All of it, 4 years." The silence that followed was different from other silences she had experienced in this room. It had a specific density, the silence of a man encountering something he had long ago decided was behind him and finding it unexpectedly in front of him instead. "Miss Whitmore, he told me," she said, "in the last letter, that you were the kind of man he would trust with something he valued greatly." She paused. "I want you to know that I read that and was very angry with him." Something moved across Alexander's expression, not quite what she expected, not relief, something more undefended than that. "That's understandable," he said. "I was angry," she continued, "because it was a presumptuous thing to decide, even if he was right." She looked at him directly. "Was he right?" Alexander looked at her for a long moment. The lamp threw a warm, uneven light across the desk between them, across the letters, across his hands resting still on the ledger, across the specific quality of attention he gave her that she had noticed weeks ago and had not yet found a category for. "I don't know," he said. "That's not false modesty. I genuinely don't know if the man your father corresponded with is the same as the one you've been living alongside these past weeks. People are not always consistent across contexts." "That," Eleanor said quietly, "is the most honest thing you've said to me." He looked at the letters on the desk. "Why didn't you correct it?" she asked. "The reputation, the Hartwell story, you had years. Correcting it would have destroyed the thing I built it to protect. So you chose other people's safety over your own reputation. I chose the outcome that caused the least damage. That is not how most people would describe the same decision." He said nothing. Eleanor picked up the letters and held them for a moment. and then, without entirely planning to, set them back down on his side of the desk. "These belong to you more than to me," she said. He looked at them, then at her. She turned toward the door. "Eleanor." It was the first time he had used her name, not Miss Whitmore, not the formal, careful distance she had grown accustomed to. She stopped. "Your father." He paused, and she heard it. The slight interruption in the breath, the thing a controlled man does when something catches him unexpectedly. He was a good correspondent. I looked forward to his letters. She stood at the door with her back to him and her hand on the frame, and she felt it. The stone between her ribs, the grief she had been folding and refolding for 3 weeks, shift just slightly. Not lift, just shift. He would have liked knowing that, she said. She walked out before either of them could say anything that cost more than they were ready to spend. In the corridor, she stopped. She pressed her back against the wall and breathed in the cold quiet of the house, the distant tick of the hall clock, the creak of old stones settling in the night air, the particular silence of a place that has been standing long enough to be patient. Her father had known. He had known about the Hartwell matter. He had known about the man behind the reputation. He had known, with the quiet precision of someone who had been paying attention for 4 years, that Alexander Cavendish was not what London believed him to be. And he had trusted that eventually so would she. She was not ready to decide if he was right, but she was beginning to understand that the question she had walked into this house asking, "Who is this man I have been given to?" was no longer the question she was carrying. The question now was different, and it frightened her considerably more. The invitation arrived on a Thursday. Lady Ashworth's winter reception, the kind of event that existed less for pleasure than for the careful collective business of London society deciding in real time what it thought about things. Who had risen? Who had fallen? Who had made a choice the room had not yet ratified? Eleanor read it at breakfast. She set it beside her cup. Across the table, Alexander looked up from the letter he was reading. He had a particular way of reading correspondence, still unhurried, his expression giving nothing away, that Eleanor had catalogued without meaning to over the past weeks, the way you learn the habits of a house you are beginning to think of as yours. "Lady Ashworth," she said. "Yes, you've already seen it. Mine arrived yesterday." She looked at him. And it would be strategically unwise to decline. "That," Eleanor said, "is not a reason to attend a party. In certain circumstances, it is the only reason." She considered this. Outside, rain moved against the breakfast room windows in slow grey sheets, the same rain that had been arriving and departing all week, never quite committing to a full storm, just enough to keep the gardens wet and the light flat. "What will they want to know?" she asked. "Everything," Alexander said. "They will want to know whether you are, in the particular vocabulary of these rooms, suitable, whether you understand your position, whether I made a reasonable choice or a peculiar one." "And which did you make?" He looked at her with that steady, unreadable attention. "I'll tell you after the reception." Lady Ashworth's townhouse on Grosvenor Street was warm in the excessive way of rooms that confuse heat with hospitality. Too many candles, too many bodies, the air carrying the mingled weight of perfume and ambition and the particular tension that existed in any room where everyone was watching everyone else while pretending to watch no one. Eleanor arrived on Alexander's arm. She had not been on his arm before. The arrangement of it was practical, his hand just below her elbow, light, not possessive, but she was aware of it in the specific way you are aware of new things your body is cataloguing without your permission. The warmth through her glove, the unhurried steadiness of his pace. The room noticed them within 30 seconds. She felt it before she saw it. The slight recalibration of conversations nearby, the brief redirecting of attention that passed through a crowded room like a current through water. She kept her chin level and her expression composed and thought, with some private amusement, that this was perhaps the one situation in her life where her tendency toward stillness was a genuine tactical advantage. "Miss Whitmore." The voice came from her left. A woman, tall, fair, wearing a gown of deep green that managed to be both fashionable and effortless, which was a combination that required either exceptional taste or exceptional money, and was usually both. She extended her hand with the gracious authority of someone who had been the most important woman in every room she had entered for approximately 15 years. "Lady Pemberton," Alexander said. His voice gave nothing away, it never did. "Alexander." She smiled, warmly, precisely the way a woman smiles when she has decided in advance exactly what the smile should convey. And this must be Miss Whitmore. We have all been so curious. Eleanor took her hand. Hopefully the curiosity was not too inconvenient. Lady Pemberton's smile held. Not at all. We are simply pleased he has finally, how shall one say, resolved his situation. The word resolved arrived in the sentence, like a small stone dropped into still water, and Eleanor watched the ripples from it with the part of her mind that had been paying attention to rooms like this since she was 16 years old. Resolved, as in there had been a situation, as in she was the resolution, as in the room already had a story and had been waiting only for the character to arrive so it could assign her a role. Indeed, Eleanor said pleasantly, though I was not aware it required resolving. Something moved in Lady Pemberton's expression. A flicker of reassessment quickly smoothed. Of course, I only meant... I understood what you meant, Eleanor said. Perfectly. A half-second of silence. Alexander's hand, still at her elbow, applied the faintest pressure. Not guiding, not warning, something else. She filed it away. Lady Pemberton recovered with the practiced ease of a woman who had not been genuinely discomforted in company for many years. She turned the conversation to something safer, the Ashworth house renovations, a mutual acquaintance recently returned from the continent, and within 2 minutes had glided away toward another cluster of guests, with the serene momentum of a ship that had briefly noted a smaller vessel and moved on. Eleanor exhaled through her nose. Well done, Alexander said quietly beside her. I was perfectly civil. You were perfectly precise, it's different. A pause. She expected you to defer. I noticed. They moved deeper into the room. The second conversation was less gracious. Lord Fenwick, older with the florid confidence of a man who had inherited both his money and his opinions and had never been required to examine either, cornered Alexander near the fireplace while Eleanor was speaking with a kind elderly woman who turned out to be Lady Ashworth herself. Eleanor was too far away to hear it. She watched it. She watched the way Alexander's posture changed. Not visibly, not in any way the room would have noticed. But she noticed, because she had been paying attention for 3 weeks to the particular vocabulary of how this man held himself. The shoulders a fraction straighter, the jaw set slightly tighter, the expression not shifting at all, which she had come to understand was not the absence of something, but its containment. Lord Fenwick said something, then something else, then something that made Alexander look at him with a quality of attention that was quiet and absolute, and that Eleanor, watching from across the room, felt the temperature of from 20 feet away. Then Fenwick moved on. Alexander did not turn toward her immediately. He looked at the fireplace for a moment, the flames, the clean, indifferent heat of them, and she saw him, in the space of 2 seconds, set something aside the way you set down something heavy when you have been carrying it long enough. Then he looked up and found her eyes across the room. She did not look away. He crossed toward her. In the carriage home, he told her. Not immediately. They sat in the dark for 2 streets with the sounds of London outside and the specific silence of 2 people deciding how to begin. And then Alexander said, without preamble, "There is a rumor in circulation that the arrangement, the will, the marriage, was not your father's initiative." Eleanor looked at him. "Whose then?" "Mine." He said it flatly. "The version being offered is that I used my prior connection to your father to insert a clause that would benefit Cavendish financially while your estate was vulnerable. That the marriage is, in the particular language Fenwick used, a procurement." The carriage moved through the dark. "That's not what happened," Eleanor said. "No. My father wrote that clause. I've seen the letters. You have. London has not." He looked out the window. "If the story holds, your reputation is the more damaged of the two. A duke survives being called calculating. A woman does not survive being called purchased." She felt it settle in her chest, the particular weight of an injustice that was not surprising, but was still somehow every time slightly winding. "What do you propose?" she asked. "We move the wedding forward," he said. "Not dramatically. 3 weeks instead of 5. A formal announcement through proper channels framing the match as a mutual decision of long consideration." His voice was even, methodical, the voice of a man solving a problem. It removes the narrative window. Once the marriage is a settled fact, the speculation becomes irrelevant. Eleanor listened to the logic of it. It was good logic, clean, efficient, the kind of solution that addressed the problem without excess. "That's a reasonable approach," she said. "Yes, you've thought about it carefully. I think about things carefully, I've noticed." She looked at him. In the dark of the carriage, with the lamplight from the street catching his face at intervals, light, shadow, light, he looked like the portrait in the gallery, the man thinking about something outside the frame. "Is that all it is? Logic?" He turned from the window. "What else would it be?" She held his gaze. "I don't know, you tell me." A long moment. The carriage moved through a stretch of darkness between two lamps, and in it she could not see his expression at all. Only the shape of him, the stillness, the contained particular silence of a man standing at the edge of something he has not decided yet whether to cross. Then the next lamp. His expression was composed, careful. "The announcement," he said, "will go out tomorrow." Eleanor looked at him for one more moment. "All right," she said. She turned toward the window. The streets of London moved past in the cold and the dark, and she did not ask the question again, because she already knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent 3 weeks paying close attention, that he had not answered it. And she knew with a certainty that was less comfortable and more important, that the reason he hadn't answered it was not that he didn't know. It was that he did. It started on a Sunday. Eleanor noticed it the way you notice weather changing. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small signs that your body registers before your mind has named them. The way the air shifts before rain. The way a room feels different when someone has decided, quietly and without announcement, to be somewhere else inside it. He was still there, physically present at breakfast, at dinner, in the library on the mornings she came down early. He answered questions. He passed documents across the desk for her signature. He said good morning and good evening with the same measured courtesy he had used the first week she arrived. That was the thing. The first week. She had not heard her name in 4 days. The moment she could trace it back to was Wednesday. They had been in the library after dinner, which had become, without either of them formally deciding it, a thing they did. Not every evening, but most. She read, he worked. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. And the silence was the comfortable kind that takes weeks to build and feels, when you have it, like something you would be careful not to break. She had been reading aloud. Not to him exactly. She had encountered a passage she found interesting, and said it aloud the way you do when you are alone, and the words deserve more than the inside of your head, and then realized a line in that she had an audience. She finished the paragraph and looked up. He was not looking at the ledger. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the careful blankness, not the composed attention, but something unguarded and specific and gone the instant he realized she had noticed. He looked down at the page, said something about the passage, something intelligent, something that meant he had been listening, and the conversation moved forward, and the evening ended, and she went to bed, thinking nothing of it. Except that the next morning he was Mr. Whitmore again. Not Eleanor. Miss Whitmore, formal and careful and correct, and she understood in the particular way you understand things you would prefer not to, that he had looked at her in the library and seen something that frightened him and had spent the night building the distance back. She gave him the space. She was not certain she wanted to, but she gave it. On Friday, she went to Whitmore House alone. She told herself it was practical. There were still matters to settle, the last of her father's personal effects to sort. This was true. It was not the whole truth. She sat in her father's study for an hour without sorting anything. The house was quiet in the way empty houses are quiet, not peaceful but hollow, the silence of rooms that remember being full. Her father's books were still on the shelves in his particular order, which was not alphabetical and not by subject, but by some internal logic that had made sense only to him. His reading chair still held the impression of him, faintly, in the worn fabric of the left armrest. She pressed her hand against it and thought about his letters. "You are the kind of man I would trust with something I valued greatly." He had not been wrong. That was the part she kept arriving at, the part she kept setting down and picking up again. Her father, who had been impractical in most things, had been extraordinarily precise in this one. He had seen Alexander Cavendish clearly, past the reputation, past the silence, past the careful architecture of a man who had decided at some point that it was safer to be feared than to be misunderstood, and he had seen something worth trusting. She had seen it too. She had seen it in the gallery, and in the carriage, and in the library on Wednesday evening when he looked at her with his face briefly and completely open. The question was not whether it was real. The question was whether he was going to allow it to be. She returned to Cavendish Manor in the late afternoon. He was in the east corridor when she arrived, coming from the direction of the stables, coat still on, which meant he had been out. He stopped when he saw her. A half-second of something in his expression, and then the composure. "Miss Whitmore, I didn't expect you back until this evening." The sorting went quickly. She stopped a few feet from him. "The house is very quiet without him." "Yes," a pause. "I imagine it is." She looked at him. She had been composing and discarding this conversation for 3 days. The versions that were too direct, too accusatory, too much. The versions she wanted to have, and the versions that were wiser. She had arrived, finally, at the simplest one. "You've been very formal this week," she said. He said nothing. "I'm not asking you to explain it," she continued. "I'm not asking for anything. I only want you to know that I noticed and that I'm not. I'm not going to pretend I didn't, because I think we've been honest enough with each other that pretending would be a step backward." He looked at her with that careful, steady attention. "Eleanor, you don't have to say anything," she said. "I mean that. This is not a request, Alexander, it's just the truth." She held his gaze. "Whatever you're deciding, you should decide it properly, without feeling that I'm—" She paused, finding the word. "Waiting." Something moved through his expression, something that cost him. "You deserve better than uncertainty," he said. "I've managed uncertainty before." "That's not—" He stopped. His jaw tightened for a moment, the particular tension she had learned to read as him choosing between what he wanted to say and what he thought he should. "That's not the same thing, and you know it." She did know it. She held his gaze for one more moment, long enough that it meant something, short enough that it let him breathe, and then she nodded once and walked past him toward the east wing. She did not look back. He stood in the corridor for a long time after she was gone. The house settled around him in its old familiar way. The creak of the upper staircase, the distant sound of the kitchen, the clock in the hall that had been marking time in this corridor for 60 years and would continue to do so with complete indifference to anything that happened beneath it. He walked to the study. He did not light the lamp. He sat in the dark the way he sometimes did when he needed to think, without the courtesy of his own reflection, and he stayed there as the last of the afternoon light faded and the room moved from grey to the deep blue of early evening. He thought about the library, the way she had read the passage aloud without knowing he was listening, or without caring, which was somehow more, and the way her voice moved through the words with the same unhurried attention she gave to everything. The way he had looked up and found, with a clarity that should not have been surprising but was, that he had been listening to her for weeks, not just that evening. Weeks. He thought about the carriage, and the question she had asked in the dark. Is that all it is, logic? He had not answered it. He thought about Graves telling him, the morning after the reception, that Miss Whitmore had reorganized the household schedule again. Not dramatically, just adjusted the timing of the morning deliveries to give the kitchen more preparation time. And the way he had felt hearing it, which was not irritation, was not inconvenience, was something closer to recognition, of a kind of care that rearranged things quietly, without requiring acknowledgement, because the point was not to be seen doing it. The point was that things worked better. He thought about her hand against the chair in her father's study, and how he knew with certainty he had not been asked for, that she had done exactly that, because it was the kind of thing she would do. He thought about standing at the window the morning she arrived, and understanding in the space between one breath and the next that the woman walking into his house intended to be exactly herself inside it. No performance, no reduction. Herself, all the composure and the directness and the grief she folded so neatly, and the care she gave without announcement, and the way she looked at him like she was not afraid of what she saw. He had built the distance because he recognized it, not the attraction. He had encountered attraction before, and it was a manageable thing, something you noted and then set aside, like a weather report for a city you were not traveling to. This was different. This was the specific, alarming recognition of someone who fit into your life, not because they were easy, but because they were real. Because she walked into a room full of his silence and did not try to fill it. Because she told the truth without cruelty and gave space without coldness, and put her father's letters on his side of the desk, and walked out before either of them could say what the gesture meant. He had built the distance because he knew if he did not, he was going to have to make a decision. And the decision terrified him in a way that Hartwell had not, in a way that 7 years of a ruined reputation had not, in a way that nothing practical and external had ever managed to, because those things happened to him, and this was something he would be choosing. He sat in the dark study for a long time. The clock in the hall marked 9, then 10. He thought about what she had said in the corridor. Whatever you're deciding, you should decide it properly. Not a demand, not an ultimatum, just the truth offered plainly and then space to do something with it. He pressed his hands flat on the desk. He had spent 7 years being a man who carried things alone, who made decisions based on outcomes rather than on what he wanted, because wanting things was a variable you could not fully control, and he had built his entire existence on the management of variables. She was not a variable. She was a person who had walked into a solicitor's office and looked him in the eyes and said, "I will never belong to you," and who had spent the following weeks quietly, without fanfare, belonging to this house and everyone in it, to Polly and to Graves and to the ground staff who called her Miss with a warmth that took years to earn, and to the library in the early morning, and to the long windows in the East Wing, and to a seat at his breakfast table and a side of his desk, to him. Not because the will said so, because she had chosen to. He stayed in the dark until he was certain. Then he went to find her. She was not in the East Wing. She was in the library, of course she was, at the far table with a single candle and a book she was not reading. He could tell she was not reading because the page had not turned in the time it took him to cross from the door to the table, and Eleanor Whitmore did not stare at pages without moving through them. She looked up. He stood on the other side of the table. The candle threw warm, uneven light between them, across the book, across her hands, across the space of a conversation that had not started yet. He looked at her for a long moment. "I owe you an honest answer," he said. She waited. "In the carriage," he said, "you asked if it was only logic." The candle flame moved in some slight current of air and steadied. "It isn't," he said. Eleanor looked at him, and for the first time in all the weeks he had been watching her composure, he saw it shift, not break, just open, fractionally, like a door not yet walked through. She did not speak. "I'm not asking anything of you tonight," he said. "I only wanted you to know." He set the letter he had been holding, the one from her father, the one she had left on his desk, in the center of the table between them. A careful gesture, intentional. "Get some rest," he said. He walked to the door. Behind him he heard the faintest sound, not a word, not a breath exactly. Something smaller, the sound of a person allowing themselves quietly and privately to feel something they have been carefully not feeling for a very long time. He did not turn around, but he carried it with him down the corridor and up the stairs and into the room where he sat by the window for a long time and felt in the place where the weight usually lived, something lighter. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of it. The morning of the wedding was quiet. Not the held breath quiet of a house waiting for something to begin, but the particular stillness of a place that had already settled into what it was becoming, comfortable with it, unhurried, the way Cavendish Manor had always been, except that now it felt like something Eleanor was part of, rather than something she was learning to navigate. She stood at the window of the East Wing. The garden below had changed since February. The hedges still held their precise shape. The paths still ran clean between the borders, but the beds had come into themselves over the weeks. Snowdrops first, then the early crocuses, and now, on this April morning, something softer and more abundant that filled the air through the cracked glass with a scent she had been smelling for 3 days without stopping to name it. She was dressed. Her maid had come and gone an hour ago, and the woman in the mirror wore ivory and had her hair arranged with the kind of simplicity that required more effort than it appeared to, and Eleanor had looked at her for a moment and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, this is not a performance. There was no audience she was dressing for. There was no version of herself she was constructing for the day. She was simply herself, on the morning of her wedding, to a man she had not expected. The knock at the door was quiet. 2 measured sounds. She knew it before she answered. "Come in." Alexander opened the door and stood at the threshold. He was dressed for the ceremony, dark coat, everything precise, but he had not, she noticed, put on his gloves yet. He held them in one hand at his side, and there was something about that detail, the unfinished formality of it, that felt more honest than anything fully assembled could have been. He looked at her. She looked back. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had, over the course of 11 weeks, learned that silence between them carried weight and could be trusted with it. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I would have been down at the hour." "I know," he said. "That's not why I came." He stepped into the room. Not far, just enough to let the door close behind him, enough to be inside the same space without crowding it. He looked at her with the expression she had come to know as his most honest one. Not the composed public face, not the careful blankness, but the thing underneath. Direct and undefended and slightly effortful, as though honesty for him was always a choice rather than a reflex. She appreciated that about him. She had not told him so. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said. The first day." She waited. "In Alderton's office." She knew which words. Of course she knew. They had been in the room with them for 11 weeks, not as a wound exactly, but as a fact. The place where they had begun, the line she had drawn before she knew him, the boundary she had built before she understood what she was protecting herself from. "I've thought about it since the day you said it," he continued. "What I heard that afternoon was a warning. A door closed." He looked at her steadily. "I want to tell you what I understand it to mean now." Eleanor held very still. "You were right," he said. "You will never belong to me. Not because of the terms, not because of what you are or what I'm owed or what any arrangement on paper says." He paused. "But because belonging, the kind you meant, is not something that can be arranged. It can't be inherited or purchased or written into a clause." Another pause, shorter. "It can only be chosen." The morning light through the window was the particular gold of early April, the kind that arrived without the harshness of full summer, warm enough to be felt and clean enough to see clearly in. It lay across the floor between them. It lay across his face. "I'm not asking you to belong to me," he said. "I'm telling you that I have chosen you, not because your father asked it, not because the reputation benefits from it, not because you are—" A slight pause, something flickering through his expression. "Not because you are remarkable, though you are, and I suspect you know it." The corner of her mouth moved. She couldn't help it. "I chose you," he said, "because you walked into a room I have lived in alone for a very long time, and you did not try to change it. You simply were yourself inside it. And somehow the room became different anyway." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about the library at 6 in the morning. She thought about the gallery and his grandfather's portrait, and the man thinking about things outside the frame. She thought about the dark carriage and the question she had asked, and the answer he had not given her until 3 weeks later in the library, with a candle between them and her father's letter placed carefully on the table. She thought about all the things he had carried alone, the Hartwell matter, the reputation, the 7 years of silence, and how he had not offered any of it as justification, had not used it to ask for sympathy or credit, had simply carried it and told the truth when asked and let the rest stand. She thought about a man who built distance when he was frightened of what he felt, and then sat in a dark room alone until he was certain, and then got up and went to find her. She crossed the room. Not quickly. She walked the way she did most things, with intention, unhurried, knowing what she was doing. She stopped in front of him with very little space between them, and she looked up at him in the April light, and she let him see all of it, the composure and the grief and the weeks of careful watching, and the things she had been folding and refolding since the library, since the carriage, since the first morning she woke up in this house and thought I could stay here before she had any right to mean it. She let him see it. "Alexander," she said. "Yes, I chose you too." A pause. "I chose you approximately 3 weeks before I was willing to admit it, which I mention only so that we are being equally honest." He looked at her, and the thing she had seen in the library, that unguarded expression, the one that had been gone the next morning, it came back and stayed. His hand came up, not rushed, not uncertain, and his fingers curved gently against her jaw, and he looked at her with the full and careful attention of a man who understood that this moment was not owed to him, that it was not a resolution of a contract or a conclusion of an arrangement, that it was something freely given by a woman who had told him on the first day that she would never belong to him. Who had been right? Who was here anyway? He kissed her, quietly, gently, with the full, unhurried weight of a man who had made a decision and was not in any hurry to be anywhere else. She kissed him back. They were late to their own ceremony by 11 minutes. Graves noted this with the expression of a man who had spent 19 years expecting the unexpected, and was privately deeply pleased by this particular instance of it. The rector adjusted his schedule without complaint. The small gathering in the Cavendish chapel, a handful of those who mattered rather than a crowd of those who watched, settled back into their pews with the comfortable patience of people who understood that the important thing was not the hour. Afterward, in the garden, the reception was small and warm, and the April light held through the afternoon in that golden, particular way that feels like a gift the day didn't have to give. Eleanor stood near the low stone wall at the garden's edge, with a glass she had not touched, looking at the beds she had watched come into themselves from the east wing window. Alexander came to stand beside her. They were quiet for a moment. Around them, the sound of conversation and glass and the distant laughter of people who were genuinely glad. Not performing gladness, but feeling it, which was a different thing entirely. "When I first arrived," Eleanor said, "I looked at this garden from the window upstairs. I thought it was beautiful, orderly." "It is. Yes," she looked at it. "I also thought it was the kind of beauty that asked nothing of you." He looked at her. "I was wrong about that," she said. She reached down and touched one of the early blooms at the wall's edge. A small thing, white, persistent, growing in the narrow space between the stone and the path where the gardeners had not thought to prevent it. Something that grew not because it was arranged to, because it found the light and decided to stay. She looked up at him. He was already looking at her. And in the warm April afternoon, in the garden of the house that had become hers without anyone planning it, Eleanor Whitmore, Eleanor Cavendish, felt the stone between her ribs shift for the last time. Not gone. Her father was not gone, but lighter now, shared, carried by someone who had chosen without obligation to carry it alongside her. She took his hand. He held it. The garden held its quiet, and the afternoon stayed golden for a long, unhurried time.